Geraldine, for telling me how boring my original title to this talk was. So I was asked to discuss what we know about cognition and learning and development, Phelan-McDermid syndrome, and so that bottom smaller title is what I originally sent. But I do think what we came up with in a more creative title, what we think about thinking in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, not only will keep you awake for at least the first slide of this talk, but also is really highlights that I'm going to discuss. We're starting to accumulate knowledge and information about how cognition develops in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, what types of cognitive abilities are more or less impaired, but we're really in the midst of, I think, our most promising multi-site types of efforts, which I think are going to be highly informative and may prove some of what we think wrong in the future. Also, by way of introduction, I had been at UT Southwestern for several years, but recently I've moved to the University of Kansas, the medical center. So I'm just about in the midpoint of the country. Moves are never fun, but it's been a wonderful transition. The reason I bring it up is just to introduce this to families, that a large reason that I moved there is because there's a very promising, rapidly developing autism center there with considerable expertise both in idiopathic autism as well as genetic syndromes associated with autism, and Phelan-McDermid syndrome certainly is one that we are focusing in on in collaboration with some people that already are there. We're moving a lot of our efforts up to the University of Kansas. So if you're from that part of the country, please come and talk to me. If you're from elsewhere, you're also welcome to come talk to me. All right. Before we move too fast into things, I want to make sure we're on the same page with some definitions as we talk about cognition. These definitions come up a lot and may be used loosely in different ways, so I want to make sure we're on the same page. First, everybody in this room just about has of course, heard the phrase intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is actually a term that encompasses a number of different capacities or a number of different measures. That is, intellectual disability is defined both by deficits in intellectual functioning, meaning individuals have IQs less than 70, but also limitations or challenges in their adaptive behavior, which really relates to daily living skills, communication skills, social, pragmatic skills. So it's more than just an IQ. It's also how that individual adapts to different functions and different activities in their life. You'll hear researchers talk about developmental delays. This is parallels intellectual disability in some ways, but it's really the term used for individuals prior to age 4, as we don't yet know where their abilities are. We've developed a greater capacity to actually precisely measure intellectual behavioral types of abilities as individuals get older. And then really the focus of my talk is going to be on cognition, but this also is somewhat of a broad term that really encompasses a lot of our mental capacities, but also some of those things that we don't necessarily conjure up when we're just talking about thinking. So things like actually processing sensory information, visual information, auditory information, as well as our ability to use that information to guide our movements and to move about in the environment. So this is all part of cognition and part of what I'm going to discuss today in the context of Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So why do we want to know more about cognition in development in Phelan-McDermid syndrome? More specifically, how is this actually going to inform us as we seek to develop better, more specific, and more impactful treatments for individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome? It's really, as we've seen from other forms of intellectual disabilities, it's really quite critical to understand specific patterns of cognitive, sensory motor, types of impairments in individuals if we're going to understand where the disorder, what the causes of the different aspects of the disorder are, as well as if we're going to better understand how to treat those different aspects of the disorder and to measure the effectiveness of our treatments. Intellectual disability has often been considered to be lifelong, but there certainly are recent promising advances in our understanding of how genetic neurobiological processes contribute to syndromic forms of intellectual disability, including Phelan-McDermid syndrome, that suggest we may be able to impact some of these cognitive abilities that I'm going to discuss later on. But certainly our knowledge of this area is limited. It's limited by the majority of studies that we have to this point relying on questionnaires and different reports that certainly provide highly valuable information and have really informed the field, been the primary resource for information in the field for quite a while. But they also are subject to limitations, both in terms of biases that can seep in there as well as precision in terms of our measurement. And then we're starting to see now studies generate really quantitative information that are utilizing standardized tests. So tests that we can use with person A, get a score, and directly compare that score to a large number of people that have taken the test previously, so we can know how far they are from the average, above average, below average, whatever it is. So these standardized tests are much more quantitative and specific in terms of the information they can yield, and we are now starting to see reports on larger numbers of individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome with some of these standardized tests. That being said, even these standardized tests themselves have their limitations, which I'm going to get into in just a bit. Practice parameters, Alex Kolozan and several other colleagues have really laid out a beautiful map of how we need to approach treatment and assessment of individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome as it relates to this topic, to cognition. The prescription is that general intellectual and developmental abilities should be assessed regularly using some of these standardized instruments. So in other words, instruments that are going to be interpretable for physicians, for clinicians across the country, across the world, so that the information is meaningful and reliable across different clinics or different hospitals that you may go to. They also note that some of the motor developmental delays and motor problems that we see in Phelan-McDermid syndrome need to be carefully assessed and should be addressed as early as possible when we start seeing individuals showing motor signs. A good bit of information that we know about cognition and learning in Phelan-McDermid syndrome also is informed by studies of animal models, believe it or not. This is data from Craig Powell's lab, who's a colleague down at UT Southwestern. Sorry, Craig, I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but really these quantitative studies, they've been done in Dr. Powell's lab as well as a number, Joe Buxbaum, other people that are here, that have actually been highly informative in understanding some of the behavioral and cognitive aspects of Phelan-McDermid syndrome by virtue of studying animal models where SHANK3, the SHANK3 gene is deleted or knocked out precisely. And we can see from this particular data set, let's see if I have a pointer. I don't know if I have, yeah, I do have a pointer. This is going to require some motor skill. So you can see up here, this is just data from, I'll go through it quickly. This is data from a SHANK3 model that shows that these mice essentially don't learn as fast as mice that don't have this deletion. This particular test is a Morris-Watermaze test. It's a very commonly used test for mouse studies. In short, the mice are dropped into a tub of water and they're having to swim around. Eventually find a submerged platform so they can stop swimming and they can rest. And over time, they learn the location of this platform and they go to it because they don't want to be swimming all day or treading water. And so what we see, though, is in the SHANK3 deletion animals, we see a reduced rate of learning. They don't learn as quickly where that platform is. And we can also see from these models that you can test other aspects of cognition. The bottom data shows that when you then move that platform, they have to learn a new location. This is really sort of more of a higher level, as far as mice go, type of cognitive ability where they had learned a particular skill and now they have to sort of ignore that skill and learn a new location. How quickly do they reverse or switch over? And actually SHANK3 mice looked okay in this particular study for one measure of it, but another measure they didn't go to that new location of the platform as regularly as the control mice. What I'm trying to pull from this data is that we can learn about Phelan-McDermid syndrome from some of these animal studies, but also different aspects of cognition may be more or less impaired in the animal models at least, and this may be true of individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome as well. The neurobehavioral phenotype of Phelan-McDermid syndrome, this is not actually an exhaustive list, of course, of areas of challenge that we've seen in patients. But we do see deficits in language and in communication. Audrey Thurm is going to talk about these in the next session. We see hypotonia, we see sleep disturbances. That's going to be talked about in a future session. We see repetitive motor activities, similar to some of those that we see in more general autism, but there may be differences in Phelan-McDermid syndrome compared to autism in terms of the type of motor problems that we see. Certainly we see attentional problems and then atypical reactivity to sensory stimuli. So this may include both sensory hyperreactivity, they're overreacting to certain sensory inputs or changes in the environment, or it could be sensory hyporeactivity, where they don't seem to respond to auditory information that is incoming. So this is a highly sort of complex aspect of cognition, that is sensory processing, that we're starting to learn more about using both standardized tests as well as measures of physiology. There now are some quantitative studies looking at different aspects of cognition in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. I'm showing most of these studies up here in this table, and there's a couple pieces of information to glean from this table. One is that all of the studies that have been done have shown global deficits in IQ or development. When standardized IQ tests are administered, we see individuals scoring within that within the range of intellectual disability, meaning 2 standard deviations out. We also see that in motor for motor tests and sensory tests. Another piece of information, these studies have really been fantastic in sort of moving the field forward in a more quantitative way. Several of them include smaller numbers of individuals, and that's something that we're really sort of building on now as a research community, is being able to assess in a consistent way across sites larger numbers of individuals, so we get to really better understand the diversity of the cognitive abilities and cognitive deficits across different individuals, affected individuals. I highlighted one of these studies that came from the Mount Sinai group, which did this with over 30 individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And what you can see here is that, what you can see is that we do see reductions in intellectual, nonverbal intellectual ability on standardized tests, but we see some diversity here across the individuals that were in this particular study. So, for example, for nonverbal IQs, we do see someone that was in that study who scored within the average range. We saw there were several individuals within this study that were in the mild to moderate range in terms of the level of intellectual disability that they showed. But then we did see the majority of individuals were in that severe or profound category in terms of on the IQ test. The authors also indicated that there were rather profound deficits in language abilities as well as in motor abilities. The language deficits looking more severe than the motor deficits. So they're starting to be, with this type of data, with this type of information, we start to see some patterns of which aspects of cognition may be more or less impaired than other aspects, and therefore giving us really sort of targets for treatment and thinking about causal processes. So based on these studies that have been done, it does appear, and again, we're really needing more individuals to see consistency across individuals or across studies, but it does appear that language abilities may be most consistently or robustly affected in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. There does seem to be some variability in terms of the cognitive abilities that we see across different individuals, and there is evidence suggesting that the severity of these intellectual deficits vary in relation to the size of the deletion. And then there's based on a smaller sample size study, there was a suggestion that attention and executive abilities may be more impaired than visual spatial processing and visual motor coordination. This is based on a small number of adults. And let me back up and just make sure that I define those terms for you. When I talk about attention, it's just attention is a big term, but we're talking about individuals' ability to just to process, to attend to incoming information. Executive abilities are really sort of higher level types of abilities. Our ability, you think of an executive of a company, the ability to actually organize information, make plans for how to act on that information, problem solve, and then to, once you're told that that plan's not going to work anymore, is to shift and make a new plan. So these are really sort of complex, high-order types of cognitive abilities that mature later in life for many of us, sometimes not at all for several of us. But these are sort of higher-level skills. They seem to be really more severely impaired in individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. But what I would say, based on this data where we are, is we really need more studies at this point to systematically look at how these different aspects of cognition are affected in Phelan-McDermid syndrome and then how they develop over time. There is some data looking at cognitive abilities, motor abilities, language abilities, and how they change across childhood and into adulthood. And what they show is, if you look at across these different abilities, if you look just in these inside these red squares, you have a DG in there. Excuse me, and that's a developmental growth index. When you see a positive number in there, what you're seeing is an index of how many months of maturity you see per participant over a 6-month period. And so a positive number means that they are showing advances in that particular area. What you see here is that those advances aren't quite as fast as you expect within over a 6-month period, but the positive numbers tend to aggregate down here at the left side, suggesting that the developments that we're seeing in individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome are occurring most rapidly early on in life, really prior to about 6 years, and then we see some curtailment of that development later in life. This gives us a bit of an idea about the developmental windows that are going to be most critical for intervening. But again, this is something that is really being pursued more heavily, and which will be talked about later in the McPosium as we look at natural history for individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. I've referred to this now a couple of times, this multi-site collaborative study that I'm very proud to be part of. The Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, which is headed up by Mustafa Sahin at Boston Children's, and then the Phelan-McDermid syndrome component of that is headed by Alex Colazan and the Mount Sinai group. And this really is, I think, an important study for this area, in that the aim is to comprehensively understand or characterize cognition as well as cognitive development in individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, with the added layer that this will be tied into to genetic information, genetic data that's being acquired, so we can understand how genetic processes relate to cognition, development, and learning in individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. There is some hope that we'll get a better handle on this, not only in running larger studies or more collaborative studies with more individuals, but also developing better tools which we can use to actually measure cognition. There's a suggestion from a couple groups now, actually, that have been using computerized assessments to understand cognition and intellectual disability. You can see a title or a paper here that assessed cognition in Fragile X syndrome. Now, Fragile X syndrome also is characterized by intellectual disability, and this particular study showed that we can get a better handle on cognition in Fragile X syndrome by using some of these newly developed cognitive. I have 1 minute left. Wow, and I thought I was going to have to kill time. But this is a suggestion that that using cognitive tests may sort of advance us beyond some of the standardized tests that we're using that really have significant limitations when we're using them with individuals with severe intellectual disabilities. I'm going to run through this then, and I'm going to skip that particular portion of the slide, but to say that as part of this rare disease consortium, we're also really getting started with a series of neurophysiological studies. So it's hard getting a really objective measure of an individual's sensory processing or cognitive abilities when intellectual disability may be rather severe or there may be other behavioral challenges. We're trying to understand the brain physiology of individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. Through the support of the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, we're looking at specific responses to sensory information, specific brain responses of individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And this particular study is getting started across multiple sites in collaboration. Paige Seiper is helping to lead this study as well. Since I'm getting looks and all kinds of nonverbal cues that I should stand down, I'll leave with a message of hope, and that is that research in this area really is accelerating. I hope that in 2 years I can come back and talk about really systematic studies that have been completed or precision measurements on cognition, so we really better understand these aspects of Phelan-McDermid syndrome and can move towards actually treating them in an effective way. And I think we're moving down that path rapidly now as researchers. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Matt. We are also hopeful that in 2 years' time you'll be able to come back and provide us with more answers to the questions we're going to be talking about right now. So I don't do, to my fault, we do not have any poll everywhere questions for this session, but we want to encourage you to have great discussions at your table. And if you need to get up and stretch your legs, there's coffee right outside in the hallway. Just grab your cup, come back, and resume your discussion.
I'm going to try to get this panel discussion started now while the other panelists are filtering up here. Since there were no poll questions, I thought we could start this a little bit early. My name is Paul Wong. I'm a pediatrician from Autism Speaks. I very much appreciate the invitation that Geraldine extended to me to help moderate this panel session. And I can't resist an opportunity to talk, so I actually asked Geraldine, besides moderating, can I show some of my own slides? And she didn't say no fast enough. So I am actually going to show some of my own slides that I hope are relevant to the discussion topic here. And then I'm also sitting at one of the tables with the parents of 14 to 16-year-olds. I'm going to try to represent them with some of the questions that I heard around our table and ask our panelists to address that. So I'm going to try not to take too much time, talk about this. Ivory towers, FDA, and you. And by ivory towers, of course, I mean the academic institutions, which are so important. And most of the people you're hearing talking today are from ivory towers, although I don't think they're guilty of the kind of isolationism that a lot of academic researchers might have been guilty of in the past. There is fantastic research on animal models of Phelan-McDermid syndrome, just like there has been on animal models of other genetic syndromes. And I actually don't know Phelan-McDermid very well. I used to be an academic, and I did work on Down syndrome, on Williams syndrome, on 22q11, not 13. That's another genetic syndrome that's very common, on Fragile X syndrome as well. And you know, with the animal models, obviously you can do things that you can't or you wouldn't want to do with people who have the condition. You can stick wires into their brain and stimulate them and record the responses, and you can dissect their brain. And obviously that's not something you would do with people. And what's amazing is that researchers and people from Dr. Buxbaum's lab and many other researchers who I don't know here have done incredible things with the SHANK3 animals and with these other genetic syndromes. They're really excited about this. I'm really excited about it. It's really cool. You can make a SHANK3 deficient neuron learn better by treating it in a certain way. You can make a SHANK3 mouse more motor coordinated than it was before. That is really cool to me, to these researchers. But of course, that's not what you want. It's great the mouse is better, but we would like to find something that'll help individuals who actually have Phelan-McDermid SHANK3 deletions. So I got an email in preparation for this conference from someone who probably wanted to remain anonymous, but I got her name up here. Let's just call her Geraldine B. She said, I'm just a mom, okay? And I just want my kid to learn faster, not forget so easily, follow directions better, be calm, have fewer problem behaviors, talk more, etc. biomarkers, mouse models, and neurons aren't what I'm thinking about when I'm telling my kid for the 10th time to put on his shoes. We understand that. We want practical benefits from the treatments, and the good news is that FDA is on your side, okay? Now, let me just say for a minute, FDA is not the be-all and end-all, of course, and there are a lot of issues with the processes and the regulations that FDA follows. But I think, actually, if a drug is FDA approved, that is a pretty tall yardstick that it's been measured against, because FDA is actually pretty demanding. They're always thinking about safety issues, and they say, we're not going to expose anybody to any drug risks unless we really think it's going to help people. So FDA is not going to approve a drug because it helps mice. FDA is not even going to approve a drug because it helps a child in the psychologist's laboratory perform better on a computerized test of attention. FDA wants to refer to something Dr. Mosconi talked about. FDA wants something else Dr. Mosconi talked about. FDA wants to see improvements in real-life adaptive function. Dr. Mosconi talked about adaptive behavior, adaptive function as part of the definition of intellectual disability. That's what FDA is looking for. They basically approve drugs for 3 reasons. I lifted this slide from them because it makes people feel better, and that's something like depression or anxiety. You actually feel better. You function better, and we're talking about people with muscular dystrophy walking farther, walking faster, or somebody with pulmonary disease breathing more easily. Being someone with asthma being able to breathe in and breathe out more easily. Or they approve things because people survive longer than they would otherwise, or maybe they have fewer seizures better controlled, something like that. Basically, FDA is looking for those practical benefits. So they are on your side. They want to see that practical day-to-day benefit. So the challenge is in translating the animal research, going from the little mouse or the zebrafish or the rat or whatever it is to people. This is what's happening in Fragile X syndrome. Dr. Mosconi also did me the favor of mentioning Fragile X syndrome. They're trying to translate things. They have great results in mice and in other animal models, but so far they haven't figured out whether or not those benefits translate to individuals who have that condition, and that's going to be the challenge for Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And to speak for the researchers for a moment, the challenge is to find which of those laboratory tests you're doing really are closely tied to improvements in day-to-day function. So yeah, great that the brain waves improved. Is that important on a day-to-day basis? That is the question. If you can prove that, then FDA might approve the drug just by improvement on the brain waves. If you can't, then they're going to say, okay, but what is really happening on a day-to-day basis? And that's harder to measure. It takes longer potentially. It's harder to measure. It's noisier to measure because I'm hearing, and this is not a surprise, kids are different from day to day. So if you happen to test somebody on a bad day, even though the drug's really helping, it's not going to look like it helps or something like that. So that is going to be the challenge for academics. So really that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. And we'll turn over to the panelists now to answer some of the questions that you guys have and that I heard at my table. Let me just introduce the panelists, and I can take these off, thank you. And I apologize, I know some of the panelists modestly well at least, and others I don't know that well. On the far end of the table, just guessing, we have Dr. Tobias Beckers from University of Ulm in Germany. Next to him, Dr. Latha Surya, who is in Chicago now at Rush Memorial. Dr. Mosconi, who just spoke, of course, from Kansas, and Dr. Eva Loth, who's from King's College in England. I am going to start with a couple questions that I heard from the folks at my table. One of them is asking for your recommendations for sort of what are best practices for psychoeducational assessment, for drawing up an individualized education plan, figuring out the placement for a child with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. How should that be approached? And I'll toss it to whoever wants to take a first stab at it.
This question sort of came up at our table too, and I think where we're at in assessment is what we've drawn from other conditions. So what we know about intellectual assessment of intellectual disability, what we know about assessment of autism, and there are really good tools out there that we've been using in some of our natural history studies, but there are real limitations, like Matt, you talked about. So when we do standardized testing, knowing that the standardized testing it gives us a relative anchor, but doesn't really get at the level of impairment that we see in some of the families and kids that are coming in. We can't get to that detail that we need to develop a treatment plan. So just to sort of lay it out in a way that hopefully isn't too boring, the standardized tests sort of floor out, and many of our kids perform at levels, and there aren't enough items at the levels that could help inform what are the right targets for a speech intervention, what are the right targets for adaptive skills. So we need more detail at these lower levels to be able to make these educational and treatment recommendations. So a lot of what we end up doing and what we're looking to try to do clinically and then also in some of the natural history grants that we put in is to use functional assessments. So these are drawn from the behavioral analytic world. This is the world I started in autism in. And these are assessments that get at much more about links between behavior and function at very sort of gross levels. So the tools that are out there that you might hear of or see of in your education recommendations, the ABLES, the PEPR, these can really be helpful in making treatment plans. May not, and we're sort of trying to see how they work in the academic research.
Dr. Mosconi?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dr. Soria just said. But just to add to that, I think the reality is that any of these prescriptions are going to be guidelines, right? So there is variability in terms of the intellectual abilities that we see in individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So just because one family goes through a process and they have a particular test that's administered or a particular set of tests that's administered, that doesn't mean that that's going to be exactly the right protocol or way to go about it for another individual with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So the bottom line there is you want to be working with somebody who, like a psychologist or a psychometrician, neuropsychologist, who really has expertise in individuals with intellectual disability and individuals with neurodevelopmental syndrome, so they can really map out the appropriate plan for your particular child.
So what I would like to add to that as well is this session is called What We Think We Know About Thinking in Phelan-McDermid Syndrome. And I think when I first started to get interested in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, I was thinking something that I now know for sure was a false belief, and probably most of you would have known and could have told me then. And this is really that I was assuming that because Phelan-McDermid syndrome was thought to be a monogenic form of autism, that it would be more what we call homogeneous than other forms of autism. And so this now we find also in our lab is clearly not the case. So we see children who have quite similar social cognitive profiles as what is typically known for idiopathic autism. For example, difficulties in orienting to social information, like their name being called, or other things. Whereas other children with Phelan-McDermid syndrome are just as good as that, but they show the opposite profile, or don't have variability between social and non-social information. So what I'm trying to say is I think the kind of therapeutic intervention, as much as a treatment, might need to be geared at the kind of social or cognitive profile that individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome have, and some of them might be more akin to a typical autistic profile and others not. So one of the things that had come up on our table was a mother said that the child was very good at memorizing things, and so rote memory is something that is typically also linked to strengths in the cognitive profile of autism, as is like a good eye for details. And so a better understanding of these kind of features, like strengths in absolute or relative terms, or also talent, might be very valuable to also be incorporated into interventions.
Dr. Becker, anything to add?
So I'm working with mouse models, so I cannot really tell about patient work so much, but what I'm seeing now in mice, and there are different Shank3 mouse models out there, and all of them are kind of reflecting situations that patients have, stop mutations or loss of the gene, And I think we are now, as researchers, we should really try now to compare these different mouse models, whether they're really leading to the same molecular alterations and behavioral alterations in the end, to really see whether compounds that might react on some of the receptors you have seen here displayed, whether this is really something that's only working in a specific mutation versus in another mutation that's not working. So before we really start compound screening, we need to know whether the target structures are identical in all these patients' cohorts. And I believe that stratification only with respect to Schenck is affected is not sufficient. I think we have to stratify according to the specific mutation before we start thinking about treatments.
So Dr. Becker, just to tie that more explicitly to the first talk this afternoon from Dr. Betancourt, we heard that people do have different types of mutations, some bigger, some smaller, interstitial versus big, huge, contiguous gene deletions, smaller point mutations, frame shift, et cetera, et cetera. Are those the different animal models?
Exactly, yeah.
He said yes, exactly. Okay. Another issue that I heard about at my table, and I think other people have alluded to it as well, is the issue of regression and loss of skill. And I apologize if this is something that is already widely talked about, but I'm new to Phelan-McDermid. How common is that? When do you see it? Is there anything that seems to precipitate it? What do you do about it?
So the exact same question came up at our table. And I think the parents had the answer, or whatever answers that we would have, and that is that these natural history studies are where we're going to start to find out some of these answers. That we, I think sort of late in the protocol, added regression questionnaires. And we are finding sort of the limits of these questionnaires already in our work in the beginnings of this natural history study, where regression seems to come up not just what we think about in autism at a particular one point in development, but that over the life course that we're hearing reports of regression in various domains. Sometimes even when you add on new skills, we heard it from 2 families, I think, at our table. We've heard it from families in our clinic. So you gain, they, make gains in, let's say, speech, but then they learn or add on another skill, and that old skill is lost until you reteach it. And so this is a fairly sort of recurrent conversation we've had with families in the natural history study in clinics. So hopefully some of the work that we're doing will give us some.
You mentioned longitudinal studies, and I'm just going to ask Dr. Loth to tell this audience a little bit about a study based in Europe that she is helping to lead in autism more broadly. But I think it touches on this longitudinal issue. It touches also on biomarkers and things like that, things like brain waves or MRI of the brain and things like that, and why that's important, how it could be useful in the future.
Thank you. Can you, yeah, okay, great. Yes, so indeed, so as part of the EU-AIMS consortium, we have set up 2 large-scale multi-center studies. One is with infants at familial risk for autism by virtue of having an older sibling with autism, and we're following these children from 4 months roughly through to 36 months to see what are the earliest predictive markers for the development of autism. And then we have a similar study that starts at the age of 6 years and goes through the age of 30 years, and that also asks the question, can we identify so-called stratification markers that might help us to, in a way, divide a very diverse group of people with autism into potentially biologically more similar groups? And might these different biological subgroups help us to predict, whether one child might have a better progression of symptoms over the course of their development, and also which child or which individual might benefit from particular treatment A versus particular treatment B, and so then to enroll into clinical trials people where we think or estimate they have the biggest chance to benefit from that particular medication or intervention. And then we had a gap, and this is because in our preclinical work led by Tobias Buckers and other colleagues with a focus on Schenck3, there was a great interest in looking at sort of like the molecular mechanisms associated with, for example, SHANK3 deficits, using animal models, but also induced pluripotent stem cells. But we didn't have a patient study until I met Geraldine and Sue and Megan, and they were so persuasive in persuading me that it was absolutely necessary to also set up a patient study with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, and I had absolutely no clue, and we're still learning. And so we did that, and so we set up a study that basically draws on components of both of these longitudinal, larger scale studies to look at also biomarkers that are directly linked to perhaps a SHANK3 abnormality. And so we're particularly interested in sort of like electrophysiological, functional, but also cognitive differences that may be linked to glutamatergic function.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump in with an editorial comment here, although I suspect I'm preaching to the choir and talking to the people who are here. There's a session I know tomorrow afternoon, Jump in the Research Pool. The water is warm at 3:15. And I know that the panelists up here and all the other researchers in the room will agree. Your participation as families who are affected by Phelan-McDermid syndrome is absolutely essential to progress in the field. We need your help. Frankly, the researchers need your kids to better understand what Phelan-McDermid syndrome is like, what happens over the years, how it evolves, how we can track that, what are markers for improvement or for worsening potentially, and then, and I know there's already exciting research going on, what treatments will work, what are their side effects, and are they really efficacious? Your participation in that is obviously central, invaluable. None of that can go forward without that. So thank you for those of you who are already participating, and for those of you who are in a position that you could participate in the future, I hope you really will consider that. I think we're pretty close to the end of the hour. I don't know if there are any other questions in the audience that someone wants to stand up and pose to us. If not, thank you, and thank you to the panelists.